Late in 1943, several German officers captured in North Africa were loaded onto ships and escorted across the Atlantic to a small American town where the war in Europe still raged, but everyday life felt like another world. Neon signs blinked on storefronts, cars sat bumper to bumper along the streets, and people moved with a casual rhythm utterly foreign to men who had left behind blackout curtains, ration cards, and the constant anxious counting of days and calories, so they walked in silent, clipped steps, boots whispering on pavement until the guards steered them through revolving glass doors and into a sight that stopped even seasoned soldiers cold. A grocery store that stretched farther than their eyes or imagination could immediately take in, its steady, glare-free lights banishing any thought of air raids and bathing aisle after aisle in a calm, relentless brightness, shelves loaded so perfectly they seemed staged for a picture. One of the officers later wrote that if the scene were a theater set, it would be overwrought, that no city in Europe, not even Paris before the war, had exhibited such food for people who had grown used to coarse black bread. And the sight of white loaves stacked into gleaming pyramids felt almost like an insult. Everywhere they looked, abundance met them. Mounds of oranges, clusters of bananas and glossy pineapples, fruits many had only ever seen in illustrated magazines, were piled as casually as potatoes. And for men whose homeland's blockade had made even apples rare by 1942, these tropical goods seemed a kind of thumb in the nation's eye. One officer reached out, then hesitated, whispering to a comrade that it must be propaganda, and the guard only snorted as the prisoners began to count instinctively. Soldiers' minds cataloging crates and stacks and trying to imagine how long such reserves might feed divisions at the front. Quartermaster records added a cold arithmetic to their astonishment. A single American supermarket in 1943 could move more food in a week than an entire German garrison consumed in a month. Figures that pointed to a logistical and industrial reach Germany had not achieved, but statistics mattered less than what their senses reported. Aisles seemed endless and the lists of available items infinite. Butter, eggs, ham, coffee, breakfast cereals, canned vegetables stacked like ammunition, and a silence heavier than the bright air settled over them as memories of Berlin queues returned, where mothers clutched ration coupons for a sliver of margarine, and soldiers at the front survived on turnips and thin soup during icy campaigns. What unnerved them most was not just the volume, but the casualness of ordinary shoppers. Housewives pushed carts without hurry, deliberating between brands as if such variety were normal. While back in Germany, a single can of peaches could be worth bribing an official or smuggling across a border, here a child tugged his mother's sleeve to demand a different flavor without ceremony. A guard offered one officer a small bottle of Coca-Cola. He turned it over, suspicious of the amber liquid he'd only heard about in whispers as a frivolous American indulgence, twisted the cap, tasted it cautiously, and found it sweet, fizzing, strangely invigorating. And in that fizzing pause, the first real crack opened in the fortress of certainty he had carried across the ocean. That fracture widened in the next aisle where refrigerated cases hummed and glowed, and the fruits at the entrance felt suddenly like appetizers compared with long walls of canned goods. Tin after tin. Labels lined up with near-military precision promising peaches, corn, beans, soups, coffee, and even dog food, which caused some of the officers to murmur in disbelief, because in Germany scraps barely reached soldiers, while here animal feed came in packaging that appeared finer than what many Reich civilians received. Colonel Hans Richter, steeped in Prussian military tradition, stopped and later recorded that the enemy's strength lay not only in steel and oil but in endless shelves, that if those tins were genuine, the adversary's capacity might seem inexhaustible. The record supported his dread. American factories in 1943 produced over 40 billion cans of food, many times Germany's wartime output, so each supermarket was more than a retail space. It was a node in a vast system of preservation, distribution, and consumer choice, every label proclaiming what once seemed impossible: fresh milk, chilled butter, bacon slices carefully wrapped and sealed. While German authorities had struggled to deliver rations even to elite units during the brutal winters on the Eastern Front, American civilians, untouched by invasion, spent ordinary afternoons debating which butter tasted better, a trivial quarrel that to the prisoners felt like evidence of an entirely different world. What wounded them most was not scarcity, but surplus, whole aisles set aside for preference rather than need, and the sight cut deeper than any battle wound. A young private named Eric leaned close to a comrade and murmured that if their men could see this, they would question why they had bled at Stalingrad. And his words hung in the refrigerated air of the meat counter where thick steaks gleamed with fat streaking through the flesh. Sausages coiled like braided ropes, and towering blocks of cheese rose higher than helmets. Scenes that would have bought silence in Berlin, where a gold ring might be traded for a scrap of butter. Yet here a boy squandered pocket money on a wedge of cheese he would likely not finish. They had been taught to dismiss American plenty as staged spectacle, a set dressed for cameras. But the mechanics of what they watched denied that excuse. Clerks refilled shelves with a brisk, practiced rhythm that hinted at overflowing warehouses a short drive away. Forklifts and hand trucks hummed in the storeroom as crates disappeared into stacked pallets, and delivery trucks rolled up daily. Engines idling while men offloaded produce and meat with the same ordinary efficiency used to drop off coal. When later they examined shipping manifests, they learned a small Texas market received weekly shipments of meat and grain that exceeded what the German Sixth Army had on hand at the height of its Russian campaign. A comparison whose cold arithmetic spoke more forcefully than any propaganda rebuttal. One officer tightened his jaw, thinking that had such supplies been visible in blockaded Berlin, the populace would have adored the Führer. Yet here people moved through abundance without notice, a housewife strolling past butter columns as if variety were the ordinary order of life. Turning an aisle corner, they expected more displays of goods, but instead found their attention drawn upward to a ceiling of relentless light, rows of fluorescent tubes that shone like captured daylight, steady and merciless, making rows of tin plate sparkle as if polished. For men raised to live beneath nightly blackouts, where even the glow of a cigarette risked an air raid, that uninterrupted brilliance felt close to sacrilege, and yet taught a lesson no catalog could convey. Beneath the light, a constant mechanical whisper rose from the refrigeration units. Fans drawing, compressors pulsing, a cool breath running along the aisles that kept meats and dairy at a denial of decay. The officers pressed palms to the chilled glass, watching frost bead and feel its cold through their uniform sleeves, astonished that these goods were preserved not by luck, but by continuous, reliable power. The statistics behind the spectacle stunned them as much as the sensory evidence. America's 1943 consumption of over 170 billion kilowatt-hours dwarfed what the Axis could muster. And with more than 2,000 power plants operating by mid-wear, some facilities were so vast they consumed in weeks the coal other regions used in months. A single Tennessee plant, they learned, produced enough electric current to light all of Berlin, a fact that underscored how Germany, hampered by bombed-out plants and coal shortages, rationed electricity so tightly that factories often fell silent at dusk while American towns shone on. They had been told that discipline and sacrifice would win the war for the Reich. But what discipline could match a society that could freeze thousands of pounds of meat for civilian consumption while still fueling fleets of bombers, tanks, and ships abroad? Colonel Richter, the eldest among them, breathed a bitter observation that if every American household glowed this way, they were not simply fighting another army, but confronting a continent bathed in light. And his comment lingered as they moved toward the store's wide back doors, where a delivery scene stopped them again. A refrigerated truck backed to the loading bay, its driver and helpers unbolting crates of butter and cases of milk and passing them inside with the same casual efficiency one might use to deliver coal in peacetime. The contrast closed around them like a vice. In Germany, trains groaned and starved for fuel. Whole divisions in Russia had suffered and even died for lack of bread. Yet here the mechanical heartbeat of a logistics system, engines idling, lifts clanking, manifest books kept up to date, meant shelves would be replenished tomorrow and the next day, a hum of industrial assurance that felt as implacable and unsettling as any battlefield formation. They fell into a heavy, speechless silence. For how could any creed of scarcity persist in a country where fuel and freight moved in unison like the twin veins of a behemoth? And even that realization was only the threshold of what lay beyond the supermarket's chrome and glass. The vast machinery of movement that carried food from field and factory to every small town across a continent far larger than any European theater. The loading doors rolled up and they watched men hand down crate after crate of milk, butter, and fruit into the store as if performing an ordinary chore. The trucks themselves, painted with familiar company logos and fitted with insulated trailers, seemed banal to local eyes, but to the captives they were a revelation. Not government ration wagons or armored convoys, but a countless civilian fleet running with military punctuality and imperial reach. In Germany, trains were choked with troop movements, and coal shortages had already throttled civilian deliveries until whole provinces knew weeks without regular bread. Here, refrigerated lorries pulled up at neighborhood grocers every day without fail. Lieutenant Brenner later wrote that food moved faster than armies, where supply lines back home were measured in weeks and months. Here they were measured in hours beyond a single truck. And as the prisoners began to trace that invisible system, they saw arteries of transport, highways fanning coast to coast, rail lines threading plains and mountains, ports unloading crates onto rail cars and trucks, and a choreography of timetables that bound farm to plant, plant to depot, depot to shop. By 1943, the nation claimed hundreds of thousands of miles of paved roads and 250,000 miles of track. Trains bore Kansas wheat, Nebraska beef, California fruit, and Pittsburgh steel at a tempo the Reich could not match, and one grim accounting in their reports noted that a single American freight train could carry in one run more supplies than an entire German division consumed in a week. Colonel Richter whispered that while the Reich might overrun nations, these people had overrun distance itself, and the arithmetic was crushing. In 1943, American railroads moved freight measured in the hundreds of billions of ton-miles compared with a fraction of that in Germany, and no capture of Moscow or Cairo could erase the basic fact that the enemy's transport capacity dwarfed whole theaters. The men had been schooled on blitzkrieg, armored spearheads and lightning thrusts, but here was a different kind of blitz. Locomotives, tractor-trailers and freighters flinging not shells, but an unrelenting flood of provisions beyond the reach of any front. Private Eric watched a child skip by clutching a paper bag and muttered that if bread moved like this, tanks could be anywhere with frightening speed. And as one truck left, another rolled in, the officers understood that shelves and vehicles were only the visible ends of a sprawling chain. Canneries converted fruit into stacked tins, creameries bottled milk by the hour, slaughterhouses chilled and wrapped beef into neat cartons. And behind those factories stretched farms so large and mechanized that the compact German estates resembled backyard plots. They later saw, beyond town limits, the beating heart of the system. Fields stitched with combines and tractors, fertilizer and irrigation feeding acreage measured in the hundreds or thousands, barns emptied into conveyors, silos feeding mills, while factories hummed with stamping presses, conveyor belts, and rows of machines sealing lids and boxing crates with industrial rhythm. A single plant could output in a day what entire regions could not in a month. Forklifts shuttled pallet upon pallet as if stacking fortifications of tin, and Lieutenant Brenner murmured that this was industrial warfare by other means, where their soldiers fought with bayonets. These civilians fought with factories and assembly lines. The scale of agricultural production stunned them. Millions of tons of canned goods, billions of pounds of beef and butter flowing into civilian and military channels each year. Farms worked by mechanized harvesters, and an agricultural economy geared to mass production, while German plots struggled under fuel shortages and returned draft animals to the plow. Beyond the rail yards and highways lay ports crowded with cargo ships and liberty vessels. Cranes loading cases onto hulls that would run convoys to supply allies and armies abroad. A maritime network as much a part of the logistics web as road and rail. All of it, the farms, the canneries, the refrigerated trailers, the rail yards. The dockside gangs moved to schedules, to manifests, and to a culture of maintenance and spare parts that kept engines running. refineries supplying fuel, and power plants humming. This deep infrastructure meant restocking was not accident or luck, but design. The guards, half amused by the prisoners' stupefaction, eventually took them to see these fields and factories, and the sight reduced private wonder to a darker certainty. Smoke rose from tall chimneys. Conveyor belts rolled an unending parade of cans, stamping presses stamped, and men in overalls watched meters and dials as if tending a new kind of front. One officer scrawled that a single Kansas estate could feed more mouths than whole provinces of Saxony, and the thought that an enemy might be sustained by such a system hardened into the conviction that what they had glimpsed in that single store was the visible edge of a capacity so deep and broad that it could, in time, grind down any force that could not match it, transforming their stunned disbelief into the cold knowledge that victory might depend less on bullets than on a society's ability to produce, preserve and move abundance without end. The sting of comparison bit deep, a salt that would not wash away. Germany's proud Junker estates, those symbols of aristocratic lineage and rural prestige, looked diminished beside American family farms tilled by ordinary men who drove tractors that dwarfed whole batteries of German field guns. It was a contrast of acreage and apparatus. Fields worked not by human backs and oxen, but by relentless machines. Tractors that ran almost non-stop on gasoline from a country that produced roughly 2/3 of the world's oil. Combine harvesters that reaped wheat with mechanical arms, and binders that stacked corn into towering shocks while in the fatherland farmers still stooped over hand tools. The difference was not merely scale, but technique. Where a German peasant plied a scythe, an American operator sat in a steel cab and multiplied a single day's labor into the yield of 100 men. Linked factories turned those harvests into lasting goods, grain into loaves, fruit into preserves, meat into tins of stew, everything preserved, labeled, and shipped out in days. The farm and the plant formed a closed industrial loop so efficient it felt almost invulnerable. Colonel Richter gazed toward where tilled earth blurred into factory chimneys and muttered that these people did not wage war with soldiers only, but with an entire continent's productive force. As the convoy curved back toward town, the officers noticed a building marked with a red cross and saw men unloading crates not of food, but of medical supplies, bandages, penicillin ampoules, morphine. An ordinary scene to the Americans, but a revelation to prisoners who had watched comrades die of infections that might have been treated here. It slowly registered that abundance extended beyond victuals and steel. American industry was turning out pharmaceuticals by the ton, and hospitals that could sterilize wounds and deliver drugs made once fatal injuries survivable. That realization bored into them as surely as any shell. They returned to their quarters that night with minds overfull and diaries filling with lines that would never pass Berlin's censors. The evidence gathered in their journals could not be reconciled with the Reich's narrative of a decadent, collapsing America sliding toward ruin. They had walked through markets brighter than any municipal hall in Berlin, toured factories clamorous and precise beyond any parade ground drill, and passed farms vaster than the estates of aristocrats. And the question gnawed at them. If civilians lived amid such plenty, what reserves back the American armies? Lieutenant Brenner put the thought into words in secret. If what the state called weakness produced this level of plenty, what then might genuine strength yield? The sentence disclosed a fear every man felt, but few admitted. The pillars of their ideology were cracking. Young Erich, who had been raised in Hamburg amid the ruins of Allied bombing where his mother had waited in long lines for a few scarce ounces of butter, found his memories colliding with the casual waste he now observed. American children discarding half-eaten sandwiches into bins outside the supermarket. And the collision was a kind of violence to him. He whispered that his mother would weep at such waste. For Erich, the war had always been cast as a fight for bare survival, a desperate defense against starvation. Yet here food was so plentiful it approached negligence. Colonel Richter, older and more steely, clung longer to silence, but even he could not escape the tremor. Staring at the wash of artificial light outside the barracks, he muttered that if this were ordinary life in America, then the exceptional sacrifices demanded of Germans might not suffice. Rumors moved through the prisoner community like lit embers, figures that had seemed implausible only a short while before. Roughly 96,000 aircraft produced by 1944, one Liberty ship launched every 3 days, wheat harvests reaching some 2 billion bushels, and those whisperings matched the reality the officers had seen in a single grocery. Numbers that could be checked and cross-referenced did not lie in the way propaganda did. They confirmed the visual proof that abundance was systemic, not theatrical. How could the Reich sustain itself when a single American farm could feed more mouths than an entire Saxon province? How could a doctrine survive when one factory outproduced whole sectors of a nation's industry? Surrounded by arithmetic and manifest ledgers, the prisoners felt cornered by facts. Unlike speeches and slogans, figures could not be flattered into plausibility. Then, as Christmas approached, when men expected only rationed bread and empty days, the officers witnessed gestures that cut more sharply than any statistic. American families left parcels at the POW camp gates, bundles of tobacco, sweets, and hand-knitted scarves for men taught to regard the enemy as monstrous. The generosity was bewildering and devastating. For a moment, Eric held a bright red apple tied with ribbon and looked at it longer than any weapon he had ever gripped, feeling in that small, glossy fruit an intimacy and tenderness that his military training could not process. He scribbled that the Reich had preached sacrifice and worshipped scarcity as a moral good. Yet in the land of steady lights and limitless shelves, the enemy wielded plenty itself as both instrument and argument. The realization widened the crack.